Let me be the first to welcome our first presenter, Mr. Conrad Hughes. Conrad is a senior history major and classics minor with focus in Viking studies. He's a Herc tutor and executive member of the Medieval and Ancient Club of History, or MOC, where he has collaboratively written a play based on Greco-Roman comedies. Tonight, Mr. Hughes will be presenting the Rus Khaganate, Before the Calling, a work focusing on the movements of Vikings in Eastern Europe. Mr. Hughes.
Thank you very much, Keegan. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming. I'll be speaking to you all tonight about the Rus, the Scandinavians who lived within Eastern Europe and Russia, what we call today Russia, during the 9th century, focusing on the early 9th century specifically. During this time, a lot of people see the massive connections that happen between the early medieval world have direct contact with how the Vikings spread Islamic silver and other luxury goods. This entire era can be defined by some of these trade routes and some of these changes that happen within society. I'll start today with an example. In 838, a group, an embassy from Byzantium was sent to the court of Louis the Pious, who was the German emperor at the time. And in this embassy, there were a group of men who called themselves the Rus. The king was very suspicious of these men because he knew their look, he knew their speech, and it reminded him of the Swedes and the Danes. And though these men came from the Far East, and they called themselves Rus, and they even said that their leader was a Khagan, the German emperor identified them as Scandinavians. And there's been much debate over the past 100 and or so years. Let's see if this will turn on for me. Up and down. That's... No.
Oh, he's doing a lot of things.
There we go. There we go. You can see this embassy came from Constantinople to Ingelheim here, where the court of the French emperor was. Sorry, the German emperor was, Louis the Pious. And these Rus men identified with a group of people called the Sphere, who lived in middle Sweden around the Birka area, which is a small island on an insular lake. These Rus traveled then back to their homeland, or possibly their hereditary homeland, to Scandinavia. And we know this from a wide range of material evidence that has been gathered by Swedish and Russian scholars both, where we have evidence of the seals of the leader of this Byzantine embassy, not only in Birka, but also in Hedeby, in Ribe, and at Strada Ladica, which is over here in Russia. And from this evidence, we see that these people who call themselves the Rus are not only Scandinavian, but also have traces, obviously, further east. Now, switching gears to the name Khagan, to this idea of who these Rus were led by. They were led by someone with this very Eastern name. It is a Turkish term, the Khagan, for a steppe nomad leader. He would rule a Khaganate. This is pre-Mongolian, so So not a Khan, there's an extra syllable in there from the earlier Turkish linguistic forms. And you can see at this time, there was a group called the Khazars, who ruled the most powerful Khaganate in the Eastern European, Eurasian steppe lands. And in this area, you can see on this map here are a large amount of items and areas which have been found identifying with both Khazarian and Byzantine items mixed together. And so, we can see that the Khazars, the Byzantines, had heavy influence with each other and communicated often. At the same time, we see that these Rus, who are Byzantines, also have contact with the Khazars.
Where is it? Where's the? Point it towards the. Yeah.
There we
the
go.
monitor. Yeah.
Here in Sweden, this is the site of Birka. This is the island. You can see that the water line has changed from at where it was during the medieval period and where it is now because of the rise of the land. As the glaciers receded, the land has been rising for the last several thousand years. And we find here in Birka that there are evidence of burials that have steppe nomad customs intertwined with those of the Vikings. This one is specifically a really good example as it shows a man and a woman tied together with their grave goods and 2 horses also put within the grave. And this is something that we find not only in Scandinavia, but we find it far more prevalent in Eurasia, on the steppes. Here's some more items, and specifically this one is the interest of a lot of people. It has drawn a great amount of scholarship to it because it is a woman who is buried with significant weapons, a sword and an axe, and 2 horses. So she not only held a high status, but also some sort of martial status, very possibly. Here at Birka, we also find a great amount of evidence of their contact with Islam. And here at this item is a bronze vessel which has Islamic script written across the top. And it is found in a grave at Birka. And also there is an incense burner here, and we have a ring with Islamic script written upon the bottom. And these are all grave goods that are found in different grave sites that we know them to be buried with these people and that to be significant. You would not have had this in your grave if it were not an item that meant something to you. So, we have these evidence in the far north of possible contacts with these Khazars, but we have a very, very vivid explanation or scene given by a writer about 100 years after the period, but he gives a beautiful picture of a Viking burial upon the Volga River. And this is the author Ibn Fadlan, and he writes, he was the ambassador to the Bulgars for the Caliphate. And in his role, he wrote about his travels and many strange peoples he met and saw. And one of these, most significantly, is this burial of a Viking. He calls him a king. He's probably more of a sea king or a konungur, as we would say in Old Norse. And that signifies a certain kind of mobile kingship. Maybe not exactly directly connected to a piece of land. But he he in his description shows that this burial is not only connected to Scandinavian customs, but also has certain elements which would have come from the steppe nomad peoples. And now bring it back around to what I mentioned earlier, the numismatic evidence. This is the coin evidence that we find of the trade relations between the Islamic Caliphate and this northern European sphere, the Baltic Sea. And as you can see, there is a most significant amount of hoards of these coins here on the coast of Scandinavia and in Gotland and near Birka here. And that these hoards served as a kind of bank for these traders. They bury them, and when the time comes for maybe you needing to withdraw from your bank, you go find where you've buried your hoard and dig it back up. And thankfully we have tons that weren't dug back up where the person died. And so you have a great amount of evidence of this trade seen through this. And Thomas Noonan is definitely the most prolific scholar upon the subject. So where does all this come in? I'm trying to connect the Khazars and the sphere and see where they have a relationship. And I see that most in some of this early art that we have. This items over here are all found in Middle Sweden in the late 8th to early 9th century, and these are found in the 7th to 8th century on the steppes. And this is the Svalto Makaji culture, or the Khazar culture. It is one is a polity and one is a material culture, so they're interchangeable. You can see here, number 12, the direct correlation it has to number 2 here. That these two items are nearly the same pendant. Yes, it's a pretty simple form, but the evidence doesn't end there. If you go deeper and look at the artistic form of their horses, see the neck on both and the placement of the legs, very, very similar. And if you look into, I don't provide a slide, but there are picture stones all over Gotland which show some of these same images of the sun, of these horses, that have a direct correlation to those made in Khazar or Svalto Majaki culture. So, the Rus Khaganate, before the calling. The calling is this, the calling of the Varangians. So anybody who's steeped in the scholarship will get the joke. Nobody else does. Because that happens in 860, and this, my research focuses before that. And the calling is when many scholars see this is the first time Scandinavians come to Russia. That's what a lot of scholars coming out of Soviet Russia believed. That Scandinavians weren't present in the East before 860. The evidence, when you piece it all together, both from the material and the literary, you come to a much different picture than was believed for a very long time. But that's not to say that the Scandinavians did all this alone. They were very much helped by all the many groups who they came in contact with and intermarried with, as intermarriage was a huge part of connecting these trade routes through these rivers. And with that, I'll say, I'll leave you with this. This is an image of a coin from the 8th century, a King Offa of England. He decided that this is what a coin should look like. This is what a royal seal should look like. And on the back here is Islamic script, is Arabic, and it You want to read it for me?
لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
Thank you. I could not.
I'm
and
a English professor.
yes, I thought you were. And yeah, so this is very interesting that we had this as early as the 8th century. This English king copying an Islamic coin to make his own coinage, to mint his own coins. And so, if you're interested in anything more I write, on the top is my academia site where I post most of the papers I write. And on the bottom is where I post all my fiction, things like that. Because next year I will be going to Missouri to study historical fiction writing, doing history and creative writing interdisciplinary program. So thank you very much. I appreciate all your